In this video, I'll be going over chapters 14 and 16. We'll start with chapter 14, and for both of these chapters, I'm using the shortened version. So for chapter 14, this is just kind of an extension of the previous chapter 13, except we're looking at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So some of the major functions of the spinal cord, which we would consider part of the CNS, and then your spinal nerves are part of the PNS branching. One of them is the structural and functional link between the brain and the rest of the body. And we definitely know what we learned in the brain is that medulla oblongata facilitates this attachment. And so what we often see when we use our spinal nerves is we get sensory input from the body and then motor commands from the brain, and those will be sent out throughout. We also have something that isn't really involved in the brain, but occurs in the spinal cord with the spinal nerves. And these are spinal reflexes. These are responses where the brain does not process things, and they're generally very fast reactions when a stimulus is present. So looking at kind of the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, it is separated out into different sections, okay? And we do have different names. The major four parts, something that you learned in laboratory, are going to be cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. So named for the regions of the body that they kind of exist in, right? Cervical in the neck area, thoracic around the rib cage, and then we have lumbar, lower back, and sacral around the sacrum. There are a few other structures also present. We have some areas where there is a large number of neurons, so it's a bigger part of the spinal cord, one in the cervical region called the cervical enlargement, and the other in the lumbar region called the lumbar enlargement. So for these nerves, and we've learned this before, nerves are cable-like bundles of axons. So typically in the CNS, right, we are going to call our groups of neuron bodies nuclei, and that's what we'll kind of call them for the spinal cord and the brain. But when we're thinking about nerves, especially spinal nerves, we are looking at those bundles of axons. And usually the grouping in the PNS is going to be those dorsal root ganglia, because we call them ganglia when they're coming off of the spinal cord. And in addition, we have ganglia throughout the body, which are going to be these groups of neurons producing these axons that we see as the nerves. We learned in the brain that there is 12 pairs of cranial nerves. As far as the spinal nerves go, there are 31 pairs. We're not going to memorize all of them by name, right? But we know that a lot of them group together in these bundles called plexi. Last kind of structure is called cauda equina. This is going to be at the inferior border of L1, right? Your lumbar vertebrae. And we end up getting a bunch of nerves kind of culminating there. And it kind of looks like a horse's tail, which is where we get the word cauda equina, which means horse tail. So let's look at some of the terminology relating to these nerves. So we have these kind of small structures coming off the spinal cord forming the first part of the nerve called rootlets. Rootlets just meaning a smaller portion, and you can see they all kind of culminate together to form the first root. We have a posterior root and an anterior root. You may also call them dorsal root and ventral root. The posterior root is on the back of the spinal cord because it is posterior, and that's where we actually find our first ganglion, which is your posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion. Again, ganglions are just areas where we have large amounts of neuron bodies in the PNS. The anterior root does not have a ganglion, okay, and that's going to be found on the front anterior. These neurons that are present, okay, and the sensory information that these nerves guide, okay, and we'll notice here each root you can see coming together and it's going to actually form the nerve. And it's important to note that all spinal nerves are considered mixed, meaning they have both a sensory and a motor function. Any of the signaling, okay, coming from the posterior area of this root is going to be sensory. And any of the information, okay, coming from the anterior area is going to be motor. And so both of them come together to form these mixed nerves, which all spinal nerves are mixed. So Let's look, just like we did at the brain, some support structures for the spinal cord. And these are going to be very, very similar to the brain, different bones, but we are going to have the same meninges and the same cerebral spinal fluid. So we have what we call our vertebral column, which is the groupings of our vertebrae that are going to house, okay, your spinal cord. And we have these vertebral foramen that we've learned previously for these bones. And when they all form together, they allow for us to form the vertebral canal, which is where the spinal cord actually goes through. And importantly, these intervertebral foramina, we see kind of in between each vertebrae, is where the spinal nerves are going to exit, which are attached to the spinal cord. We have meninges. These are the same meninges that protect the brain, right? Pia mater being the innermost one that actually touches the spinal cord. Arachnoid mater is the middle one, and dura mater is the outside one. So let's look at some of the mixed functions that we see with the spinal cord since we have both sensory and motor neurons. So in the spinal cord, the designation of gray matter versus white matter is a little bit different than in the brain. Typically for the brain, we see that we have gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. This is the exact opposite for the spinal cord. For the spinal cord, the gray matter, which is representative of all the neuron bodies, okay, which we call nuclei in the spinal cord and the brain. And you can see here I'm highlighting it, this butterfly structure. Internally, we have gray matter, and we actually separate it in names by horns. We have posterior horns, anterior horns, and lateral horns. Posterior horns contain your sensory neurons, which eventually create axon bundles that become part of the sensory portion of our nerves. The anterior and lateral horns both have motor functions. And again, their axons are going to bundle as part of this nerve for that motor portion. Again, posterior is going to be sensory, anterior is going to be motor. There's a few other structures that we see. Gray commissure, which is going to be surrounding the central canal in the center where cerebral spinal fluid goes through. This is just areas of gray matter. And as I mentioned before, we call gray matter those neuron cell bodies, which in the CNS are called nuclei. And again, just to reiterate, sensory nuclei are found in the posterior horn, and motor nuclei are found in the lateral and anterior horns of the spinal cord. So let's look at some of the reflexes. So reflexes are rapid, pre-programmed, involuntary responses, okay, for muscles, glands, okay, based on a stimulus. And so what we see here for this rapid, pre-programmed aspect is that there's not going to be a control center essentially sending out conscious signals involved. The brain is not part of this. The response is rapid, it involves very few neurons, and it's pre-programmed, meaning that when we stimulate a reflex, the response should be the same every time. And if the response is not the same, that can be indicative of a neurological disorder or neurological trauma. So this is our basic reflex arc, just showing the pathway that our neurons will use in order to stimulate a reflex, right? We have some sort of reaction from a receptor in the skin. It sends it through a sensory neuron. We can recognize this as a unipolar neuron. It synapses in the spinal cord with this interneuron, and then the motor neuron, which we can recognize as multipolar, is going to send out a signal for that reflex to be accomplished, and this will happen within seconds. This is our basic reflex arc. We involve a sensory neuron, the spinal cord, and then our motor neuron. So there are some ways that we can actually classify these reflexes. We're not going to learn about all the reflexes. We're just going to learn some categories today, but some ways that we might classify them. We might see them as spinal versus cranial. We're only talking about spinal reflexes in this case. They could be somatic or visceral. Somatic meaning they're sending a signal to a skeletal muscle, or visceral meaning that they're sending a signal to an internal organ involving cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or gland. They could be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Maybe monosynaptic, we have a direct interaction, right, with the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Polysynaptic might involve interneurons, like we saw in that previous picture, multiple neurons. They could be ipsi or contralateral, meaning ipsi if they are involved with a reflex on the same side of the body where the stimulus came from, or contra, meaning the stimulus came from one side of the body, but we sent the signal to the other side. And then some reflexes are considered innate, okay, we're born with them, and others are acquired. We develop them after birth. So let's look at some of these categories for common spinal ones. They are going to be stretch, Golgi tendon, withdrawal, and cross extensor. And all of these involve a group of receptors, which we call proprioceptors. And proprioceptors are involved in signaling skeletal muscle. And so some of these, right, we have a stretch reflex and a Golgi tendon. These involve different things we might call muscle spindles or we might call Golgi tendons, which receive information from the proprioceptors, right, telling us some information. In the case of the muscle spindle, okay, which is a really good example for a stretch reflex, muscle spindles can actually detect stretch and they will help us from overstretching our muscles. So let's take a look at that muscle spindle proprioceptor, okay? You can see that there's a connection here between the spinal cord and this skeletal muscle. We have the sensory neuron, okay, and we've got the motor neuron output. And so the stretch reflex is essentially using this muscle spindle proprioceptor in order to determine stretch in muscles. Golgi tendon is a little bit different, and it does say it in the name. It is going to prevent us from overly contracting our muscles, overstretching them. And Golgi tendons, instead of being attached directly to the muscle, like we saw with muscle spindle proprioceptors, these guys are attached to the tendons, which are connecting the muscle to the bone. So both of these are for prevention of overstretching or overcontracting of our muscles. Some differences, muscle spindles are directly attached to muscles, it says it in the name, and Golgi tendon organs are directly attached to tendons, as it says in the name. Again, these are going to be instant reflex reactions so that we do not overstretch or overcontract our muscles. The other two are withdrawal and cross extensor reflexes. And these are very protective. Withdrawal is exactly as you might think. It pulls a body part away from a painful stimulus. So the instant reaction you might have when you feel pain in a certain area, you can see this person is barefoot stepping on a jagged rock, okay? That instant move away from that painful object is a withdrawal reflex, and it is stimulated by pain receptors, which we call nociceptors, which we'll see in chapter 16 as well. Another one is going to be the cross extensor reflex, which works very, very well with our withdrawal reflex. The withdrawal reflex is helping us move that body part, in this case, the foot, away from the painful stimulus, but it involves other muscles in the leg in order for the foot to actually move. And that's where we get these cross extensor reflexes. These allow the opposite side limb to support body weight while the hurt limb withdraws. So if we have this hurt limb, this foot with these other muscles withdrawing, this cross extensor reflex allows us to basically create a good foot to stand on. Okay, right here, this cross extensor, allowing us to bear the weight onto there while we do the withdrawal reflex with the opposite leg. These are some of your basic spinal reflexes. Lastly, this is reflex testing in the clinical setting. We will not be having clinical views on your final exam, so this is just extra information for you. Reflex testing is very, very common in the doctor's office, especially if there's been trauma to the brain or suspicion that there is some sort of neurological issue. And what we're typically looking for is a hypoactive reflex, meaning there's a diminished or absent response to a reflex that would normally occur, Or there's a hyperactive reflex, abnormally strong response, which may form something like a clonus. If you're interested in learning more, I did a video of a clonus where a reflex is stimulated by this doctor, but the person cannot control the reaction for it. I'm going to switch over now and stop sharing so that we can switch to chapter 16. Pull up chapter 16. This will be kind of the last part here. So chapter 16 mostly involves receptors for what we call our general and special senses. We don't have time in this class to do special senses, but those are going to be your sense of vision, hearing, smell, and taste, associated with very specific structures in your head, like your eyes, your ears, your nose, and your mouth. We will talk about in chapter 16 general senses, which will help us understand our sensory receptors. So your sensory receptors, part of their general function is to provide information about the external or internal environment so that we can respond to a stimulus and then send it through whatever pathway to the control center. And so each type of receptor responds best to a different stimuli, and we'll talk about the different types of receptors in this chapter. So for our general sense ones, which are the ones that we focus on, these are going to be simple structures that we can find throughout the body. Some of them are going to be tactile for touch. Some of them are what we just learned, proprioceptors, which kind of regulate muscles, tendons, joints, and stretching. Other ones might be visceral. Okay, we can find them in internal organs. They can monitor stretch, right, which would be a proprioceptor. Chemical environments, that'll be a different type of receptor. Temperature and pain, all different types of receptors that we'll look at. So we can put these receptors into categories. We call them extero, intero, and proprio. Extero means that they are feeling stimuli in the external environment. Intero, the internal environment. And then we already looked at proprioceptors in chapter 14, which are going to detect body and limb movement because they're attached to muscles, tendons, and joints. So let's take a look at some of the categories. We have some major types. They're going to be chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and nociceptors. And some of these you might recognize, like nociceptors. First one is chemoreceptors, and chemoreceptors are found in very specific places in the body, and all they do is detect chemicals, as the name would suggest. Externally, right, they could be detecting part of our sense of smell, right, if we have a special sense organ. Internally, they could be detecting changes in chemical levels for gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, those types of things. So chemoreceptors detect changes in chemicals. Thermoreceptors, you can think of the thermometer, right, as this kind of beginning prefix, thermo. They detect changes in temperature. We have receptors in the skin. We also have receptors in the hypothalamus, which we know is our set point for temperature regulation in the body. Photoreceptors are part of our special sense organs. Photo means light, and photoreceptors detect changes in light, and they're found exclusively in the eye. Our last two are mechanoreceptors and nociceptors. Mechanoreceptors detect distortion in the cell membrane. This distortion we would call mechanical force, which is why they're called mechanical receptors. They detect touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch. So some of your mechanoreceptors are going to be proprioceptors. The last one is nociceptors, and we learned those previously. They detect pain. And we can have pain on the outside of the body, right? Nociceptors, or internally, which we would call visceral nociceptors. We already looked at proprioceptors in the previous chapter, but we know that the two main ones are going to be muscle spindles attached to muscles and Golgi tendon organs attached to tendons. And these are going to help us from overstretching or overcontraction of the muscle. There is a concept relating to our interoreceptors, specifically nociceptors, where we have something called referred pain. This is inaccurate localization of sensory signals. And this is where we're going to get some terms like dermatomes and other things, which we're not going to go through in this class. Essentially, what referred pain is you feeling pain in one part of the body, but it's not actually that part of the body that's hurt. It's the internal organ that is sending signals through the same sensory neural pathway. A really good example of this, and we have an example here as well, but which I'll go through. But one of the really good examples we have is when someone has a heart attack. Okay. When someone is having a heart attack, they may experience pain in the heart, okay, where the source of the issue is. But more often than not, what we see is that there is pain undulating on the left side of the body, right? The left neck, the left face, the left arm, the left hand, where we have this referred pain. This is feeling pain in a different part of the body, but the source is an internal organ. That's what we're looking at here. Inaccurate localization of the sensory signal because the pain is really occurring in the heart, but we feel it in the left side of the body. Another example here, this is showing the appendix, which follows a very similar neural pathway to the skin surrounding your belly button. When you feel belly button or umbilical pain, that could be indicative not of pain or an injury that's happening right at the umbilicus, but really appendix pain, which is in a different part of the body. This is called referred pain. You feel it on the skin at one part, but the pain is coming from an internal organ elsewhere. And that is it. These are two fairly short chapters, and you have your study guide to help you kind of understand what concepts I want you to know from each chapter. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And for my in-person classes, I will see you all Friday to go over the study guide. Thanks.